Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Marilyn Laucata Wash Process Peru from Passenger Coffee Roasters. There's the bag right there. And Passenger, based out of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And they're one of the most featured coffee roasters on this channel, as they're one of, if not my favorite American coffee roaster out there. So when I saw them release a line of Peruvian coffees, it immediately caught my interest. As I've said in the past, we haven't reviewed enough Peruvian coffees up to this point this year. So while looking through their offerings, this is the one that caught my attention, as it most sounded like my type of coffee. And given the recent slightly underwhelming experiences we've had from Passenger, I did want to go back and try some more of their coffees, as I do know what this roaster is capable of. So I'm definitely looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Passenger's recipe, which is a 15.625 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 210 degrees Fahrenheit, about 99 degrees Celsius. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one, it's definitely nowhere near as light as that Geisha Village that we had recently reviewed from them. By Passenger's standards, this is in the slightly more developed side of things, but even then, Passenger is one of the lighter roasting American coffee roasters out there. So I feel like the safe assumption is to say that most people would closely align this with a light medium in terms of that roast profile. Even then, maybe on the slightly more developed side of that, at least relative to what Passenger does. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and ran it through the V60, and the first thing I noticed from this coffee was just how well structured it was, as all of the listed notes were present and prominent throughout. It was surprisingly berry forward with a very strong and defined floral honey and a long-lasting chocolate finish. So all of the things that they had listed on here right at the forefront of this one, leaving it a very nice start. Day 16, ran it through the Chemex, and it was a slight bit more subtle on the second impression, as the blueberry feels a little bit more faint and the honey a little bit more subtle as well. While it is present in a long-lasting sense, it wasn't quite as good this time around, so still a nice cup of coffee, but definitely had a slight preference for the V60 from that first impression. Day 18, ran it through the April dripper, and it was very reminiscent of the first day, as it was a very well-defined cup of coffee. It's actually understatedly beautiful with how sweet and subtle the chocolate base is, complemented by a wonderful candied honey sweetness that continues to linger. In addition to that, the blueberry is well defined, if maybe not as overly prominent, but slightly more subtle on this day as well. So a great day, really enjoyed it through this brew method, but we continue on to day 22 as we adjusted it to Passenger's recipe, and it was another good day in terms of the vibrancy, as it was picking up ever so slightly. So this could have been attributed to a number of things. One, just the amount of time that it had had with this coffee, but in addition to that, the slight adjustments that we had made, as there seems to be a bit more sweetness and a continued focus on the blueberry and chocolate aspects with a slight bit more florality as well. Those are the two things that picked up the most, but the florality was also present, so another pretty nice day. Day 25, adjusted to Passenger's recipe with the Chemex, and on this day it was very honey forward, and I think that was kind of the defining factor, as I really liked the blueberry. The thing I was trying to get the most from this coffee was a lot more of that berry sweetness to it, and it continued to come out a little bit more faint in this brew method, and that was the big issue with the Chemex for this coffee, was the blueberry was a lot more faint. In addition to that, there was a slightly grape-like aspect to the cup with plenty of chocolates, still a fair bit of body, even with the Chemex. It's one thing I noticed was this coffee definitely had a bit of texture to it. Perhaps a slight preference towards the V60 for this coffee, as I kind of mentioned that faint blueberry wasn't necessarily my favorite thing. I wanted a lot more of that vibrancy. Day 28, back through the V60, and it's another really pretty day for this coffee, as it really opens up upon the cool down with an initially chocolate forward base being followed by an almost berry-like brightness. The cup does feel pretty desserty with plenty of a sugary sweet aspect as well, so a really nice cup of coffee on this day. Day 31, another day through the V60, and there is much more of a wild berry feel that is encompassed by a mostly chocolate forward cup. While the floral honey is a little bit more in the background, it's also well pronounced. So a lot of the things that I've been mentioning a lot, they are pretty prominent and pronounced throughout the entirety of it, and I think what you're noticing from this is I was really trying to focus in on a couple of things, most specifically that blueberry-like aspect, and given how I was able to pull that out, I was really enjoying that part of this coffee. Slight lemon peel, peachiness as well, and a pretty sugary and defined chocolate base yet again, so another good day. Really enjoyed this one. And then the final notes we have, day 34 kept everything the same, and the cup can be slightly inconsistent, as today it was a better day with a slight bit more vibrancy overall, a well-defined milk chocolate which was complemented by a honeyed focus and a little bit more noticeably pronounced in that sense today, as opposed to the blueberry, which up to that moment had been maybe the second most defining factor in this coffee, but that was a slight inconsistency, as these three things at times could rotate as to which one was the most pronounced, but even then, all three of them were very pronounced throughout the entirety of the time drinking it, so didn't necessarily have too many grievances with that. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have a lot of level 4s, so let's go through those, and I think that just kind of goes to show how I felt about this coffee, but we'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. Yes, I don't think any part of that will be surprising whatsoever, as it was a wash process Peruvian coffee, but one thing I really wanted to highlight about this one was just how well defined the profile of this one was, so even then it is on the slightly higher side of the level 4. Really nice work in that sense. Finish, level 4, yes, and the two things that were most pronounced in terms of that finish were the chocolate aspect and at times that floral honey aspect, so definitely had a fair bit of a finish to it, even then still very much in line with that level 4 mark. Sweetness, level 4, yes, and it did have a fair bit of this sugary sweetness to the cup as well, so that's one thing that I did like about this coffee, so definitely enjoyed having it reach that level 4 mark. In addition to that, of course, you had some fair bit of that chocolate aspect that was present within it, so a lot of different sweeter aspects within this one. Florality, level 4, yes, and that's one of the most noticeable things I had from this coffee right from the onset was that floral honey aspect to it. Definitely see it reaching that level 4 mark, and given that it was one of the 3 highly pronounced characteristics to it, definitely happy with it being there. Berry fruit, level 4, yes, and I think the only thing I would really change is if I ran this one through the Chemex, then at no point would I ever be able to justify that level 4, as I did struggle to get a lot more of that vibrancy from that brew method, but through the V60 it definitely reached that mark a lot of the time, and at times it was the most pronounced aspect of this coffee, so definitely happy with that there. Chocolate level 4, that's the third thing that I had mentioned was that chocolate-like aspect. I think this coffee is one that has marzipan listed on here. I'm working through a lot of coffees, but I think that this is one that had that on there. But even then, there's a very strong chocolate base to this one. So at times, maybe you could even say that it acted like a cleaner, natural processed Ethiopian coffee, as it did have a lot of those berry aspects in addition to that chocolate-like base. So really liked that part of this coffee. And then we still have a bunch of level 3s. We will start with the body at a level 3. I did mention that even through the Chemex, it had a fair bit of texture and body to it in general. So it's kind of interesting that it only landed there at that level 3 mark. I do think it's still on the higher side of that level 3. Acidity, level 3, and I think that's one thing I'm kind of alluding to with this roast profile, is this one wasn't necessarily the brightest cup of coffee. There was a fair bit of acidity, but not to the extent that it could justify that level 4 mark, so I'm actually very happy with it being there at that level 3. Citrus fruit, level 3, yes, I did briefly mention this kind of lemon peel aspect, and given just how strong and defined the other 3 profiles were within this coffee, everything else I do mention is going to be a lot more subtle and in the background relative to what were some pretty defined aspects for this one. Stone fruit, level 3, yes, I briefly mentioned as well that there was a peachy aspect to it. Both of those may be on the slightly lower side of level 3, at least relative to the very pronounced characteristics that did reach those level 4 marks. And then I think last thing really worth discussing is the caramel at a level 3, as it did have a nice candied sugary sweetness. That's something I briefly mentioned, but even then I think it was enough to justify pushing that up to the higher side of that mark. So I think this is actually a pretty nice representation. I think it's a pretty good tasting wheel for what I was experiencing from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one did kind of renew how much I enjoyed Passenger's coffees, as this one right here was a winner for me. It's probably my favorite Peruvian coffee that I have had this entire year. I do have to think back on it, but as I've kind of mentioned, we actually haven't reviewed too many Peruvian coffees up to this point this year, so this one did stand out in my memory for that reason. However, interestingly enough, we do have some more coffees from Passenger that we'll be discussing here in the near future, and while this one was really good, there's another coffee that we are reviewing from them that really seemed to steal the show, so I'm also looking forward to discussing that one. But for what this coffee is, I think Passenger did a really nice job. It definitely had a lot of great structure to it, and that's the biggest compliment I can give for this one. Is this is a very well-defined cup of coffee, and goes to show what Passenger is capable of once again. So the type of person I would suggest this coffee to, and it's something I briefly alluded to recently, and that's somebody that maybe likes their much more clean, natural processed Ethiopian coffees, because while maybe it doesn't have the same sort of wild blueberry aspect or the same sort of really strong, vibrant fruit aspects in general, this one had great sweetness, but in addition to that, what really sold it for me was the great definition and clarity, especially in terms of that wild blueberry sense. So wonderful in that aspect, plenty of the chocolate too, and then that really delightful floral honey, and at times it made it one of the more enjoyable Peruvian coffees I've had just in general in the recent past. So massive credit to Passenger for that. I think that's just kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Marilyn Laucata Wash Process Peru from Passenger Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.